As a quick example, this year China, which consumes over 95% of the rice it grows, was on course to import a record 6 million tons of rice this year. The colossal flood damage to Pakistan being a major exporter of rice to China, came at a time when China's own domestically grown crops have failed due to drought and heat wave. That drought not only killed China's crops, it killed the lights. It crippled economic activity from southwestern Sichuan to the east coast city of Shanghai, freezing international supply chains for automobiles, electronics, and other goods. The rolling brownouts left millions sweltering in their homes. Those who owned EVs couldn't drive them or charge them. Those who built EVs couldn't build them. You'll recall that the reservoirs in the rivers literally evaporated, with the impact on hydro causing factories to power down and curtail production. River logistics have been forced to switch to road logistics, and when you consider that one inland shipping vessel is the equivalent to 100 to 150 trucks, it becomes very difficult for road freight to pick up the slack, not to mention highly polluting. On the other side of the globe, Europe's drought, the worst in 500 years, is now into its 5th grueling month. Drought has reduced Europe's mighty rivers to mere trickles, with crippling consequences for commerce, freight, energy, food production, drinking water supplies, and biodiversity. Now, a workaround for waterborne logistics has been dredging, so dredging the rivers and running lighter vessels with lower payloads. But the lower water levels mean higher resistance and higher fuel burn, with the result being a vicious carbon cycle. Add to the mix Putin's weaponization of energy. Flicking the switch on Nord Stream 1 has literally left Europe in the dark at a time when 32 of France's 56 aging nuclear reactors have been taken offline for long overdue repairs. We now have French cities plunged into darkness, switching off their streetlights to conserve energy, and companies told to curb their energy use by 10%, which is not a bad thing. In Italy, the same story plays out. For the first time in 800 years, the Murano glass furnaces in Venice sit idle, empty, and cold. And Europe's biggest energy users, steel, aluminium, chemical companies, are aggressively cutting back production and switching off their blast furnaces. Now, I say all of this with a tone of impending doom. However, this crisis, which eclipses the 1970s oil crisis, also spells opportunity. It provides a much-needed fulcrum for change and a catalyst for commercializing hydrogen and utility-scale wind and solar. And certainly, we saw this last week when 8 European countries signed up to installing 260 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Sea by 2050. And it's also worth highlighting some economic modelling that we've done at Deloitte that quantifies the cost of doing nothing versus going all in on the transition. The cost of climate inaction amounts to $96 trillion to the Asia-Pacific region by 2070. Climate action, on the other hand, delivers an economic benefit to the tune of $47 trillion. However, it doesn't detract from the current issue of supply chain security. What does this all spell? This perfect storm of climate change impacts and the need to rapidly decarbonize, the pressure cooker of geopolitical tension, and with companies struggling to source their goods amid factory and port shutdowns, with products in short supply, and with price spikes fueling rapid inflation worldwide. How can companies position themselves to shore up supply chain resilience?
A bit early to say how you can make the most of opportunities arising from this crisis. What's for sure is that it's an uncharted path for everyone, but there's 3 main trends that I want to talk about. The first trend is that of a greater involvement of the state in the European economy that is here to stay for a while. We are rationing the use of gas and of electricity. In earnest, we were doing that before because we had that in our energy efficiency legislation. But we're rationing the use. We are doing price controls. We are creating stocks more than we, looking at all kinds of stocks for critical raw materials and grain. We are giving fossil fuel subsidies for a while. that we thought we could get rid of earlier than, but the fact is some of our electricity is not yet clean because prices have been multiplied by 10. We have to help people pay their bill for a while. We are, all sorts of other subsidies are being handed over, and we're also increasing taxes. Now, before you conclude that the European Union has given up on its climate ambition, I'd like to appease any worries about this, because in fact we are doubling down on our efforts. We are decarbonizing quicker than we had planned. But this requires the intervention of the state in the economy in unprecedented ways since the end of the Second World War. And this is being done in a transformational way, so not as to preserve the status quo, but to make us leap quicker into where we want it to be and help people along so that we don't leave anyone behind. So it's about the fair transition. The second, and so that you create opportunities for New Zealand businesses, because of course all green goods, the European market is a market that is open for green goods to help us transition as soon as possible. The second trend is that of friendshoring. We do not want to be dependent from jurisdiction with whom we do not share values anymore. Of course, this is us learning the lessons that Russia taught us, but it's bigger than that. It's linked to geopolitical uncertainties. And we now have wind in our sails for trade deals we hadn't had for a while. There's a social license issue for trade in the European Union. So we were very glad to finalize talks on the EU-New Zealand free trade agreements at the end of June. And that is also linked to that push towards friendshoring and wanting to trade with jurisdictions with whom we see eye to eye on so many important issues and global challenges in particular. The third learning is that this transition puts trade at the center of climate policy and not the other way around. We need access to raw materials. We need access to green technology, so we need open borders for that. We also need access to food. At the moment in the European Union, we have a food affordability issue, not a food security issue. However, there'll be less and less areas that are suitable for farming across the world as decades go by, and we need to keep borders open for food as well. The third reason is that in the European Union, we want to trade with the jurisdiction that see a light on climate, and New Zealand is determined to deliver on its NDC, and that means that we can safely trade with New Zealand as a partner that sees eye to eye.
You know, there's a lot of opportunities, as we've heard in the last 24 hours, around the things we need to do around the climate crisis, and there are a huge number of opportunities. And this just transition, when connected to the semiconductor crisis, I would categorise as catastrophic. And I say catastrophic because in the world we use 100 billion microchips or semiconductors or integrated circuits, whatever you want to call them. They are little microchips. 100 billion a day globally. And when the factory shut down in March 2020, the major consumers of these microchips are car companies. And when the factory shut down, they pulled the handbrake on semiconductor manufacturing, and no one company in the world globally has dominant market share in the manufacture of microchips. So it takes 4 hours to make one. And unlike a AA battery that is standardized now in the world where you've got the supply chain resilience to get them from anywhere, microchips don't quite work that way.
I'd just also like to make a point, I think, around the sort of the deglobalisation and the onshoring and the friendshoring, because I think we are starting to see instances of that. And, you know, I think the US, the recent announcement in the US around the over $50 billion of investment in a domestic semiconductor manufacturing capability is a good example of where we're seeing these sorts of trends. But, you know, fundamentally, I think, you know, we need to be careful that we don't equate security of supply and self-sufficiency. And this is really, I think, where trade has an important role to play in terms of ensuring that security of supply. That we've seen lots of instances and cautionary tales of where building up domestic self-sufficiency actually leaves you far more vulnerable than ensuring you've got that diversity and that optionality in terms of supply chains. You know, I think the recent, you know, and really really sad instance in the US recently where they've suffered really significant shortages of infant formula, for example, is a good example of where that domestic supply and that self-sufficiency strategy can fall short.
There is a huge opportunity for New Zealand businesses that can adopt proactively low emission strategies to add value to their products and services on the world stage. And the verdict is really out now that consumers in high GDP markets are going to pay more for climate-friendly products. One example of this is Unilever, owner of 400 brands globally, and they've put out a report recently to say that their sustainable living brands, brands that prioritise the environment at the core, are growing twice as fast as their other brands. And I think that New Zealand is in a particularly unique position to learn from Māori business practices in this space, who are really the gold star of best business sustainability practices on the world stage. Te Ao Māori approaches of prioritising intergenerational business practices, of that intrinsic link between people, tangata, and whenua, the land. This really is the gold star when we're talking about climate friendly, when we're talking about sustainability. And I think it's a huge lost opportunity in New Zealand if we don't draw on and learn from that knowledge of 2,000 years of Mataranga Māori that's right here in our country.